Hello and welcome back for the second instalment of this Cambridge Festival online event. In this part of our online tour, I will be exploring with you some statues of Aphrodite. Okay, so what we've stopped here to look at is this statue of Aphrodite or Venus. You can tell she's Venus or Aphrodite, not only because she's naked, but also because she has this little dolphin and a cherub at her leg to show that she was born from the waves themselves, from the sea. Now, normally what I would do at this point is I would ask you to tell me what she looks like, to describe what she looks like, but unfortunately you're not here, so I'm going to have to do it all on my own, really. So she's standing naked, and if I were to ask you to tell me what types of words you would use to describe her pose and how she's holding herself, you would probably tell me straight away that she's covering herself up. And so I would ask you, does she know that we're here looking at her? And you'd probably say yes, she really does, because those hands are very deliberately placed, as if she knows that she's naked and she's really feeling it, and she can tell that we're looking at her, even though she's not looking at us because she's turned her head away. And if I were then to ask you, how do we think she's feeling about this? We might say she looks quite vulnerable. And the reason for that is the way that her body is kind of hunching over, as if she's trying to make herself small. She's creating what we might call a closed posture. Or we might say she looks kind of ashamed. And in fact, it's sculptures like this that sometimes mean that people say that the very sort of beginning of female shame in the body begins in the ancient world, this sense that there is something to hide about the naked female body. Now, it seems to me that while that's in some ways a really tempting argument, it's also a very heavy weight for what are some very slim shoulders to bear here. But it's certainly true that this is a sculpture that, through its pose and the way that it engages us as viewers, sets up a particular relationship between us and Venus or Aphrodite here. And in fact, actually, it's a little bit more complicated than that, because this sculpture too it belongs in that group of Roman copying culture, of this kind of free copying that we see. Remember when at the beginning I talked about kind of little variations in pose, or sometimes big variations in pose? Now, this particular statue, in order to understand it, we need to walk a little bit further down the gallery and see the sculpture, the version of Aphrodite that it's based on. And then we can understand more what little tiny tweaks in the pose might do to change the way that we engage with and understand a sculpture, and also the meaning that the same figure can carry into similar but different sculptures or copies. Okay, so we've moved down the gallery now, and we're looking at another naked Aphrodite. And in many ways, the one that we just looked at with the hands covering herself is in fact a variation on this one. This is the Aphrodite of Cnidus. She was famous for being the first ever female nude. Of course, she wasn't the first female nude. Of course, there had been naked women drawn and painted and sculpted before. Of course, there had. But she was very special in lots of ways. And the impact that she has had on later art is felt in fact, the sculpture that we just looked at, because it's a fine example of the freedom of this copying culture that we find in Rome. The Aphrodite of Cnidus dates to the sort of end of the classical period, around about the 3rd century BCE. The original is now lost. We only know it through copies and variations, like the one we just looked at. And the original was something called a cult statue. I don't know if you guys have ever heard that term before, but a cult statue is the statue of the god or the goddess in their temple. It's the statue that the temple houses. In many ways, the temple sort of feels like one big frame for that statue. And it's where, for instance, prayers might be directed, although temples are very different places of worship than churches, for instance. In a church, everyone goes in together to worship. In a temple, everyone stays outside because that's where the sacrifice happens, because you probably don't want to drive cows up your beautiful marble temple steps, because that will not end well. So the cult statue stands inside the temple or in the sort of cultic space, and it is, for all intents and purposes, it is the goddess. She is Aphrodite. She is the very manifestation of the divine on earth. Of course, Greek and Roman audiences also weren't stupid. They knew it was just a statue. So, on the other hand, it's like two extremes. So on the one hand, the statue simultaneously both is the manifestation of the deity and is just a statue. And then somewhere in the middle, there's also this kind of thinking of cult statues as being kind of like vessels. So, the gods, they're busy. They've got a lot of different cults dedicated to them across the Greek and Roman worlds. They can't be in all of them at once. But, they might flip down sometimes to occupy their statue, preferably when you're praying to it. That would be good if they could witness your prayer. But they won't be there all the time. It's just a vessel. They can come in and out. So there is this kind of complex way of thinking about a cult statue and its relationship to the deity. And it's a way of thinking about it which maybe doesn't make much sense to us, because it means holding two sort of mutually exclusive or contradictory thoughts simultaneously at once without them contradicting each other. She both is and isn't the goddess. So the Aphrodite of Cnidus was famously housed in a round temple on the island of Cnidus on a cliff. Now, what I want to do now is unpack a little bit the pose of this statue, not just to bring out what matters about how the last Venus we just looked at down there, what matters about how that pose changes the way we engage with this sculpture, but also to show actually how complex relating to this particular sculpture is. That, on the face of it, she maybe looks like just a woman standing there naked, but if we unpack what's happening when we view her and how we as viewers engage with her, then we might realise that actually there's a lot more going on here in how the sculpture constructs our relationship to the goddess herself. Okay, so I want you to imagine that she is standing in her round circular temple, which is really unusual, and that she's facing the door. So as you walk in, you're going to walk in facing her straight on, almost a little bit like you're viewing her now, although you might be a little bit off to the side. And if I were to ask you why she's naked, you might point to, for instance, this item here. Now, that looks a little bit like a towel, and in many ways that makes a lot of sense, but it's probably her clothing, because it's her drapery, because there isn't really tailoring for women in the ancient world. So what you're looking at here is a kind of kitone or something that she would put on. And if you look down underneath the drapery, you see this jar here is a hydria. It's a very particular shape, and a hydria carries water. So these two together give her a reason for being naked. She's having a bath. But the question then becomes, is she about to have a bath, or has she just had a bath? And usually, again, you're not hit, but I would ask you what you think, and different hands would go up for different options, because actually this is a pose here that is inherently ambiguous, and in some ways I suspect it's sort of how you read it depends on where you're standing. You can read this as either she's about to pull this drapery up to cover herself and get dressed, or you can understand it as she's just getting undressed and she's about to drop it and have her bath. So in many ways then, being a statue of a naked woman means having a reason for being naked, which is probably something that isn't applicable to male statues in the same way. We might look at that in a moment. But if she's naked, that raises all sorts of questions about why it is that we're seeing her naked. So again, imagine you're walking into the temple, you're seeing her straight on. This time, let's think of her in the same way as we thought about the Venus down there. what is she doing, and is she aware that we're looking at her? Okay. So for us to feel like she's aware of us, we might expect her to look at us, but she's not looking at us, she's looking away. And she doesn't have this same sense that she is deliberately covering her body. Instead, her two hands are posed much more kind of casually than the last sculpture. And she also doesn't carry this sense that she looks particularly nervous or unhappy or vulnerable or ashamed, because she's not crouching, she's not got those shoulders raised up to her ears, she's not covering herself up, she's not pulling herself into a smaller shape. Instead, she's pretty relaxed. She looks pretty confident in letting it all hang out. Now there's a lot at stake here, because we might ask, well, what happens when you see a goddess naked? And the short answer is bad, bad, bad things. So I want you to think of Actaeon then. Actaeon, who is out hunting with his hounds, and he comes across the virgin goddess Artemis, and she's bathing in the woods. He doesn't know she's there, he doesn't mean to see her naked, but she is so angry at his violation of her that she turns him into a stag, and he is torn apart by his own hunting hounds. That is a horrible story, it's hideous. And then there's Anchises. So Anchises and Aphrodite herself, they fall in love, and they have a night of wonderful passion. And at the end of it, Aphrodite's like, you're not going to tell anyone about this, are you? It's just between you and me, right? And Anchises, he says, oh yeah, no, don't you worry. Next night in the pub, off he goes telling all of his mates. But that is my own telling of the story. If anyone is writing their A-levels or anything, don't write that as your version. But so he tells his friends, and Aphrodite is so angry that she blinds him so that he won't see her or any other lady naked ever again. So bad things. So it is a risk to see Aphrodite here naked. There is this frisson of danger seeing her naked. But there's also the potential for opportunity. Because if, when we look at her, we think she doesn't know as we come into the temple that we're looking at her, there's this voyeuristic element to the way that we're engaging with her. And one of the reasons that it feels like she doesn't know that we're looking at her is because she's looking over there. There's this opportunity for us. What we could do is step away from where we are as we've come into the temple, walk over there, meet her gaze, be the person that she's stripping naked for, or that she's getting dressed afterwards. And if we do that, I tell you what, this hand here that looks like it's kind of potentially casually covering her up, won't be covering her up at all. And of course this is also a particularly appealing way of understanding this sculpture, given that Aphrodite is the closest thing to the personification of sex and love in the ancient world that we're probably going to find. In fact, the Greek for sex is ta aphrodisia, the things of Aphrodite. And so in that respect, having these two viewing positions and being given the opportunity to imagine or fantasize a slightly closer relationship with Aphrodite simply by moving around the temple works in many ways to enact her very power. While simultaneously, of course, those stories about danger and the damage that an angry naked goddess can do give her a kind of what empower her divinity, as it were. They give her that sense of her being the manifestation of the goddess, that there's always this risk when you see her naked. And in fact, there were other stories that went around in the ancient world that sort of play off those myths and suggest that it's the stories that were told about these types of statue that really empowered them and raised them above, mere garden sculpture. So Aphrodite, for the many centuries that she stood in her temple, by the Roman period she had become incredibly famous, and she was something of a tourist destination. And we know this because people write about travelling to go and see her. So she was really famous by that point, and we have this story about a young man he fell in love with the statue, and it's recounted in more than one source. He fell in love, and every single day he would come and he would visit Aphrodite in her temple. And then one day he hid in the temple so that when the guards locked up the doors at night, they didn't know that he was still inside. And so overnight he consummated his desire for her, and he left a stain as its evidence on one of her bum cheeks, a stain that couldn't be removed. So he attempted to have sex with the statue. And the next morning, remember the guards, they don't know that he's there. The next morning, Aphrodite is so angry at his violation of her that when the guards come, not knowing he's inside, they open the doors, and the man, he comes barreling past them. Remember, I said this temple is on a cliff because Aphrodite's born of the waves. The waves are sacred to her. It's on a cliff. The man, he comes barreling past the guards, runs past them, runs, throws himself off the cliff and dies on the rocks below. Because Aphrodite, she was just as angry as Artemis was. And she punished him for his transgression. And that was just a story about the statue. But it was clearly a story that was very popular. So it's these stories and these myths that ensure that as a cult statue, Aphrodite retains her divinity and her divine power. But we're not looking at that cult statue, are we? I mean, we're looking at a plaster cast, obviously. But it's a plaster cast of a Roman copy, because the original was taken to Constantinople and it was destroyed in a fire. So there is definitely no way that we are going to find that again. It is gone. And so what we see there is a process through which Aphrodite, through free replicas that changed the size, changed the pot next to her, and in fact, actually, with greater variation, changed the way that she was posed to transform the way that as a viewer you engage with her. Aphrodite was moved through these copies out of her divine context, out of the temple. She stopped being a cult statue. And, as you walk around this gallery, if you were here, you might be quite struck by the number of naked Aphrodites that are all around you. In fact, sometimes it feels like if you were a Roman gentleman, your garden was not complete if it did not have a naked Venus or Aphrodite in it. But when you take Aphrodite, you make a copy of her, and you take her out of her temple, and you put her in your garden instead. And I suppose the you here, let's be honest, is a male, aristocratic Roman man. Does she lose some of that divinity? Does she risk coming a little bit down to earth and being just a naked woman in your garden? I think she possibly does, because context has the power to transform what the sculpture means and how it's received and how audiences engage with it. So I think these two Aphrodites are really nice, actually, for thinking not only about how those little tweaks in a pose, and they are quite small tweaks, they're not massive ones, can have a huge impact on the way that you understand a sculpture, but also for thinking more broadly about processes of replication as being productive rather than just, negative knockoffs, really.
Thank you for watching.